What they had, this is an accommodation vessel that is now demobilized, has moved off site roughly a week ago. So we helicoptered into here and did most of our survey there, went back, helicoptered out. That's a standby vessel, which is now required in terms of law, that in case anything goes wrong, there's a standby vessel there that can handle that. Deep water, I mentioned subsea development, PLEM. I don't think we need to worry too much about this. PLEM is the pipeline in manifold. All your flow lines come into that, and your riser then comes out of that going into either your FPSO or your FBS or your platform. Just another shot of a subsea development. Shot of a PLEM. Again, subsea development. I show this umbilical because with these subsea trees, the control is usually from the platform or the FPSO, and this is done via umbilicals, where all your control lines and your methanol and production lines go through the umbilical. And I mention this is because there have been lots of claims around umbilicals, either umbilicals incorrectly manufactured, installed, and then having to be fixed later. I think Paul mentioned that once installed subsea, something which is virtually just a gasket, costs millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to get the equipment there and whatnot to do it. So we had quite a few problems with that. And also what's been important with these umbilicals has been the storage and the installation and the transport of them. And what's been happening quite often is that they've been kinked. They haven't been properly stored and they've kinked. So I just mentioned this word umbilical. If this comes up in the future, you can think back and say, yes, it was mentioned in the presentation. Perhaps even go back and look at the presentation. But in fact, that's quite a high-risk area. Talking about AFE, EFE, FEED, EPIC, go quickly through these. Although they do have very definite insurance implications. The AFE is the approved for expenditure, is normally used for the well and gives an indication of the complexity of the well. So obviously, land wells probably have an AFE maybe as low as 5 or 6 million. In shallow water off Malaysia, you're probably talking about AFE of wells. So that's the cost of the well drilled, completed, etc., is probably about 18 million. And subsea, deep water, you're probably talking as much as 80 million. So it's a very good indication. And then this is important in our calculations later. We do calculations to try and estimate how much insurance our client should be buying for control of well. And I suppose you handle control of well this afternoon. And that's quite important because it's a case of the number of wells that have to be redrilled, what will be the cost of the redrilling, etc., etc. And the ECV, estimated contract value, that's important, obviously, because that establishes what the cost is for the insurance. FEED is the front-end engineering design, which is an important stage in the development of a project, because at that stage there should be enough information that they can do a good capital estimate, and from that get authorization for the project. And the FID is that final decision. EPC is the engineering, procurement, construction. You'll find there'll be EPC contracts, there'll be EPCC contracts, which include commissioning. And of course, there's a QA clause in most of these energy contracts. And the QA clause requires that there's a program in place and that's properly implemented. Enhanced oil recovery won't be affecting you guys for a while, but they're quite complex techniques which are being used at the moment for old fields where they're getting extra crude oil out of them. EML is the estimated maximum loss, and what we look at there is we try and look at a foreseeable, credible loss scenario, and then we cost that out, and that becomes EML. For an offshore platform, it's usually loss of the whole platform, because, as Paul mentioned earlier, if you have a fire or an explosion on a platform, because it's all so close together, your chances of losing that whole platform are quite good. Whereas in a refinery, it's slightly different. Probable maximum loss is sort of a case of where you assume that certain things do work, and it's fairly subjective, and most of the time insurers don't accept that, but it's a technique that's used. Vapor cloud explosion I mentioned, ALARP, QRA. Offshore platforms, crude oil production we talked about, commercial gas production we talked about. If only small quantities of associated gases is normally flared. Condensate usually comes out of the gas. This goes quickly through the processes, which once again you can refer back to later. I won't labor this, but just very quickly, your gas, your well fluids, remember, which have got a complete mixture of gas, liquid, water, everything, go into separation, the water's taken out of it. If there is carbon dioxide, that's removed. There are various ways of doing that. LPG is very often recovered in its own right, as a separate product, and then dew point correction in the gas to stop droplets of liquid actually building up in the gas. We have been involved in power generation. This is a presentation on energy, not just upstream, but energy. We have done quite a lot on power generation just lately, and we do have a department that concentrates on that. Refineries, there are 2 or 3 more slides, and that's all. But just for completeness, I've included something on refineries. How are we going for time? Not too bad. Good. Again, separation, conversion, treatment, blending. The conversion is usually a breaking down of those longer chain hydrocarbons into chains which are more valuable. And if you think of that earlier slide, your really valuable ones are sort of in the petrol range of about 5 to 13, the diesel range of about 12 to 18. So if you have long chain hydrocarbons in your crude, excuse me, what you then do is have hydrocracking that then breaks down those longer chains into more valuable fractions, and then treatment and blending. We were asked some time ago what was a hydroskimming refinery, and really it's a very simple refinery that just takes off the light ends and takes off the valuable stuff, and the rest of the crude is then sold as fuel oil, and usually that is kind of a coastal location where you have like a marine fuel offtake available. First breaking refinery is sort of the next step up. FCC, most refineries have FCCs these days, which actually breaks down those molecules. And then hydrocracking is your more sophisticated refinery, which is breaks down the chain, high pressure, high temperature, across a catalyst, using a hydrogen atmosphere. This, very quickly, is something you needn't sort of worry about too much now, but quite a useful reference slide. It just shows the different components coming out of crude oil. So just remember, we've had all the stuff on the production of the crude oil. We've had the seismic, we've looked for it, we've drilled for it, we've produced it, we've put it onto a platform, we've separated it, we've shipped it off, and then this goes into refinery. And that's what the refinery does. It actually breaks down the crude oil into those different components. So your LPG comes off the top. And then your light naphtha, which is your petrol blending component, goes that. And then your heavy naphtha into reforming. Kerosene, which is basically paraffin, which is a component very often going into aviation gasoline. And then your heavy gas oil goes into cracking, your hydrocracking that I mentioned. And eventually your heavy residue either goes into vacuum distillation. First of all, atmospheric, and then vacuum distillation, or else gets sold as fuel oil. This again is sort of a reference slide that you can look at. This is useful just to sort of show you hydroskimming, a very simple refinery, but that actually gives you quite a lot of fuel oil, which is the lowest value product, and not all that much gasoline, whereas your hydrocracking, which is your most expensive refinery that needs all that additional equipment, gives you a very small amount of fuel oil, but at the same time a fairly good yield on your gasoline and your kerosene. So that's just an indication. So it's a trade-off depending on that. Sour sweet. Jeff, you asked the question on light heavy, didn't you? This was more sweet sour. About $5 a barrel, roughly, is the spread there. And here's the heavy crude. And yeah, that's about 8. There, between Algeria, this was also 2011, sorry, Algeria and Venezuela, a difference of about 8. So, yeah. It changes, yeah. It becomes smaller, I think, with a smaller oil price. Yeah. This was a prediction on heavy light in sort of 2012, 2013, which they were saying it was going to be about 4, which is probably about right at the moment. Crack spread, it's an expression that the financial people use more than the insurers, I think. It's the kind of thing which you can look at if you have to. Refining margin is quite important. Once again, refineries should be working on about $6 a barrel if they want to make any money and keep going. Quite a few of the refineries in Northern Europe at the moment are actually working on a 0 refinery margin at the moment. It's basically just to keep the jobs going and keep the refineries running. Whereas in some places over in the States where it's quite good and it's not regulated, they're actually working at about $12 a barrel. So it's just an indication of the profitability of a refinery. And once again, use $6 a barrel as your yardstick you want to keep in mind. Just something on the Nelson Index. The Nelson Index is an indication of the complexity of a refinery, but won't dwell on that now. From the petrol blending, you can get the solvents out. You can then go into plastic feedstocks, etc. So it all starts with that crude oil, which is looked for with seismics, which is then drilled with an exploration well, which is then produced, cleaned up, exported, goes into the refinery, and many of the things that you take for granted now are actually coming from crude oil in the first place. That would be a world-class refinery. Those would be the different sort of process schemes in a world-class refinery. And once again, you can look at it in your leisure. And that's the last slide. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Talking about what he gets involved with quite a lot, and that's the risk engineering survey reports. And they're very, very fundamental, crucial consulting side, I mean, you go and talk to the underwriters, I mean, they can get an idea of what the risk is that they're actually underwriting. But certainly in the non-marine market in particular, they're quite crucial for another reason, and that is that a lot of the treaties that the non-marine underwriters have got in the energy, on their energy book, have subjectivities that require that risk surveys are done every, say, 2 years or 3 years. So they need to tick a box. They need to be able to actually show to their reinsurers. I mean, the reinsurers don't read it because they don't understand it. But the fact that they've actually been done is what's important. And so they're a really, really important tool in understanding and how you work with it. Because, I mean, you know, if the risk is lousy, then, you know, you got to come up with another idea. It's a very important aspect of what we do. I think price forecasts are very engineered focus as well. So it's an area that, I mean, Cliff could have gone on all day about the various things that the engineering department does. Risk surveys are just one small aspect of it.
With a client, give us a call and we can help. Were of each loss, and then what the main lessons were that were learned. Perhaps quite a good first session this morning because it's not a very demanding one. Lots of photographs and a bit of information at the background. Just significant, 5 of the 10 largest property damage losses that have occurred were in fact upstream offshore. And this presentation will address examples of upstream and downstream losses with certain case studies in the industry. Once again, this just shows the breakdown of the losses. Sort of pie chart that you can look at in a bit more detail later, but just supporting what has been said so far. Papa Alpha, of course, was one of the biggest case studies in the industry of all. Happened 26 years ago. Offshore the UK. And just to go very sort of quickly what the information was, 6th of July 1988. And last year or year before last, had a program up in Aberdeen, which was called the 22 Minutes That Changed Our Industry. And it was a very, very moving film. But in fact, what happened was that the Papa Alpha platform was lost, lives were lost, and a judicial investigation was put in place under Lord Cullen, a Scottish judge, and he took depositions from a large number of people and wrote a very, very good report, which was called the Cullen Report, which then set the tone for the industry after that. The facts were a massive leak of gas condensate from the pipework connected into a condensate injection pump. The safety valve had been removed for maintenance and hadn't been put back. There was a leak, ignition, and explosion, heat rupture of the risers, and which resulted in further massive explosion and fire. 167 fatalities, 62 survivors. Insurance claims in the region of £1.35 billion, which is now in excess of about $3 billion. Just a few shots of this. These are quite sort of famous photographs, which are used in case studies and studies on this all over. And the lessons learned, first of all, design issues, that the siting of the facilities and the protection of the people, and probably most important from a risk engineering point of view was the work permit system. What had happened was that this valve had been removed, hadn't been reinstalled, and the supervisor gave the go-ahead on the recommissioning of it. Not properly checked and not properly looked at. The maintenance procedures were important as well. Plant isolation, operating procedures, communication issues, evacuation procedures. All sorts of new techniques were then developed for evacuation. And a single regulatory body for offshore safety reviewing existing legislation. Lord Cullen came up, I think it was 52 recommendations. Paul, you'd remember this, 52 recommendations, I think, and every one was accepted and written. Was it 106? Is it on there? 106, yeah. What was important for oil companies and the insurers with the adequacy of limits was the value of business interruption coverage, liability or social responsibility, knock-for-knock agreements, which then became important, was the monitoring of the accumulation of the exposures. Enormous management time was then spent, public inquiry costs, and of course, reputational exposures. This was the Bombay High incident, which we mentioned briefly yesterday, importance of risers and the effect there. Some more shots of it. And the slide here shows what was there 2 hours after the fire started. The circumstances very, very quickly were that there's a standby vessel, and a cook on the standby vessel cut his finger, and they didn't have the medical facilities on the vessel itself. So they were transferring him onto the main platform, and they were doing it under bad weather conditions, and the vessel came in from the side where the risers were and lost power and drifted under the conditions, hit the risers, ruptured the risers. There was a leak. The leak ignited, explosion, fire, and as I said, the whole thing burnt out in 2 hours. Insurance claim of 286 million, and there was a platform alone, and the MSV. Now the standby vessel was also lost, and I recall that was about 60 million. And the lessons learnt, which are relevant in this particular case, is that the procedures for vessel movement are very key. The controls and having a situation where it actually lost power under those conditions was totally unacceptable. They also looked at the retrofitting of the pipework. But in fact, perhaps most important, and we look at this from a risk engineering point of view all the time, is that risers must be properly protected, and you must control vessel movement